we're beginning a new book, Hannah Arendt's book on Rahel Varnhagen, The Life of a Jewess. This is a book that she wrote as her habilitation in Germany, or originally wrote the first 11 chapters of, starting it in 1930 and largely having finished it by the time she left Germany in 1933, fled Germany in 1933. Luckily, she sent a copy to her friend Gershom Scholem in Israel, because she later lost the book, her manuscript, and Gershom Scholem was able to send her his copy back when she was in the United States, and after she had published The Origins of Totalitarianism, which uses some of the material in this book, she was able to arrange to have this book published originally by the Leo Baeck Institute, and have a life of its own. As she explains in the preface, a number of things, but one is that she adds 2 chapters to the book when she publishes it in, I think, 1957. And those 2 chapters, which are the last 2 chapters, which we'll get to, obviously, as we read the book, are quite different. And you can imagine this book having a different tone. The first 11 chapters written between 1930 and 1933, and the last 2 chapters written in the mid-1950s. And I think I think the whole is very much worth understanding and seeing the differences that will emerge. So this is a number of things to say about this book. Hannah Arendt encountered Rahel Varnhagen, who was a Jewish-born, uneducated young woman in the 18th century. She lived from 1771 to 1795, so it's a short life, 24 years. And she encountered her originally through her friend Anne Weil, who was a lifelong friend of hers and to whom this book is dedicated. For a whole lot of reasons, Hannah Arendt, a Jew growing up in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, and Anne Weil, another Jew who became her lifelong, probably closest friend, gravitated towards the story of Rahel Varnhagen, born Rahel Levin, who calls herself a Jew and a Schlemihl. Some of you, I think, know what Schlemihl means. Some of you may have a better sense of what Schlemihl means than I do. But it's a Yiddish word that means that someone who constantly messes up and fails. I looked up just to see some other definitions, and somewhere I found one that says that a Schlemihl is the person who constantly spills his soup, and a Schlemazel is the person who constantly gets spilled on. The Schlemazel's the unlucky, the person who's always unlucky in life, even though they're not bad or untalented. The Schlemil's the untalented klutz, and it's not exactly a pretty word. It's somewhat derogatory, but not as derogatory as something like schmuck, which is another Yiddish word, which has similar connotations. But Varnhagen was a Jewish woman born to a bourgeois Jewish family, and in the later half of the 18th century in Germany, a time in which Jews were being assimilated and more accepted into German society. As Arendt tells in the book, her brothers inherited the money. Her mother got an allowance. and her mother died early, and Rahel basically had very little. And so she was poor, she was uneducated, um, she had little talent, but she was brilliant in um, one area. She had an amazing imagination, and she could talk to people, and she could um, make people infatuated with her, not love her per se, but like her and find her interesting. Um, and it's this, and so she has a life in which she writes thousands of letters, long, uncensored, completely out there letters. Um, and she also has a salon where she becomes associated with and friendly with many of the leading German 18th century personalities. Her husband, who's a non-Jew, Varnhagen, was a diplomat, and so she becomes quite associated with the social scene of the time. And so Arendt writes this biography about her. This is Hannah Arendt, who had been studying with Heidegger and Jaspers and wrote her dissertation on St. Augustine. And she decides to write her Habilitation, which is like in Germany the second dissertation, on this not so well known Jewish woman who had very little education. And I think there's a lot to think about why she did it, what it means to her, and that's part of what we'll read in the book. The style of the book, as she says, she attempted to write a biography of Rahel, using quotations from Rahel Varnhagen and her interpretation of those quotations. As much as possible, she says, is an attempt to step back and present Rahel Varnhagen in her own image and her own words. And she says, to the extent she doesn't do that, she's failed. I think there'll be a lot of moments to look upon her failure. She obviously has lots to say about Varnhagen, which is not just in Varnhagen's words. But she says, again, I'm using the original Leo Beck edition, and I'm sorry about that. It's just the edition I have all my notes in. So I don't know if it's the same page numbers as you, but on the third page of the preface, she says, what interested me solely was to narrate the story of Rahel's life as she herself might have told it. And so that's the effort that Arendt engages in this book. All right. The great error, she says later on that page, this is page Roman numeral 11 in my edition, is that Rahel tried to lead her life as if it were a work of art. She tried to lead her life as if, she says, I'm letting life rain upon me. And Arendt, here in one of the moments of failing of just speaking in Rahel's words, because she's obviously here criticizing Rahel in some way, which is exactly what she says she's not going to do right before this, is to say that this was her great error. She says to live life as if it were a work of art, to believe that by cultivation one can make a work of art of one's own life, was the great error that Rahel shared with her contemporaries. So what is this error? It's this idea that you live life not in the concrete and in the specific, not with your concrete friends, not with your concrete experiences, but you live a life in which you curate that life and try and make it interesting for a wide range of people. I mean, someone who lives a life on Facebook today, right, who's curating their life, trying to make their life generally interesting, is someone a little bit like Rahel, in Arendt's words. You live a life as if it were a work of art, if it was as if it were something for to be put out there and to be consumed. And that's how our Rahel led her life. She wrote letters to people and said, "You can show them to anyone you want. I have nothing to hide. Therefore, I want them to be read. I want them to be consumed." She wanted to be seen through her letters, through her curated profile, if you will. Um, uh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I had that wrong. I'm seeing comments in the thing. Rahel, I apologize. I had that wrong. She died in 1833, so I apologize for misspeaking. She was born in 1771 and died in 1833. I had that wrong, and I apologize. March 7th, 1833. So anyway, that's the basics of the introduction or the preface to the book that I wanted to talk about. Before we get into chapter 1 on the Jewess and the Schlemihl, are there any questions about the book, the history, any other mistakes I made? I apologize. And any comments that you have. And if you want to, you can either write them in the comments here, or you can turn your mic on and ask a question.
Hi, Roger. It's Sam. Hi,
Hi,
everyone.
Sam.
Greetings from Vienna. I just wanted to say when I was going back through and rereading Rahel Varnhagen, which I hadn't personally done in about 10 years, that I was really struck by how many of her later ideas come through in this early writing. And I just think on two things. One, it was really fascinating to see the difference in prose style between this really early work and her later writing in The Human Condition, for example. Here you really have the sense that she's still in the muck of wrestling with pariahs and parvenus and Schlemihls and what it means to be a Jewish woman in Germany and what it means to be a woman at all engaging in intellectual life. There are a lot of, she's like thinking about what it means to be a woman and have beauty and, you know, what kind of power you have versus wealth. And, you know, these are topics that I think people often, you know, kind of want to talk about with Arendt, but there's not a lot of source material. And so it was really interesting to see that come through in the early writing. And then just there's so many bits that you see later on in other texts that we've read, like Hope and Despair, which opens Origins of Totalitarianism, or the bit on Rousseau. And so I think I'm looking forward to reading the book with everyone. Those were just kind of my initial thoughts.
Great. I think it's absolutely the case. I mean, that so much of Arendt's thinking in The Human Condition, but even in On Revolution, 1963, is already in a lot of this early work. It's sometimes extraordinary to realize how things that she had already seen and thought about, but weren't the main topic of what she's writing about here or in Origins of Totalitarianism, become the main topic of On Revolution. And so it is quite shocking and striking to see the consistency of many of her ideas. And yes, this is a completely different toned book than anything else she wrote. I think it'll be exciting to read. I mean, it's a book I've never taught. It's one of the only books of hers that I've never taught. I mean,
Can I say something?
yeah, please do.
I've just been reading Elizabeth Anderson, who is a political philosopher in Michigan, and a lot of what she says, it sort of sent me right back to this book because she says that a lot of the conceptions that we have about social norms and equality are very time-bound, are very constrained to the time in which they are. That making a sort of Kantian law for all times is sort of self-defeating. I know I'm loosely interpreting here, but this is what I got from it. And I think Hannah Arendt here in this book is much more constrained by time and focused on the time that she's writing, of German Jewish people in the initial phases of emancipation. And she writes more about that later when she actually deals with the subject of the Schlemihl and in her later books. Just a thought. Hope I didn't waste your time.
Absolutely. Thank you. Certainly not a waste of time. I mean, first of all, within this book, that's an important insight to keep in mind, or fact to keep in mind, that this book was written in the 1930s, most of it, or early 1930s, right before Hitler comes to power. It's written at a time when Arendt is already very involved in certain Zionist circles with Kurt Blumenfeld in Germany. And Arendt grew up, her parents were both democratic socialists. She was not a religious Jew as a kid, but she grew up with a lot of pride in being Jewish. And she's written a lot about this, about how, if anyone had ever insulted her or said anything anti-Semitic, she was supposed to turn around and walk home, tell her mother, and her mother would deal with it. So this is the time in which she writes this book is absolutely important for us to keep in mind. She talks about how it's at a time of the end of European Jewry, and she's very aware of that in the preface. The other aspect of this that's important for us in our reading of Arendt that's more long-term is her general approach to thinking, which is much more temporally and spatially grounded than someone like Immanuel Kant or Elizabeth Anderson, as you've said. And so Arendt's basic approach is not to come up with categorical imperatives or universal laws, but to think through events, historical, empirical events, stories, and from them draw insights into the world and the human condition. And so, yes, she has a very different approach to what would often be considered universal or analytic philosophy in that way. So it's important for us to keep that in mind. Thank you. Any other questions or comments on this preface or on the history of the book? People have? Anything else? Okay, let's go to the first chapter, which called Jewess and Schlemihl. This is where I got the 1795. I apologize. This is sort of the first part of her life. So the book begins, and by the way, for those, I don't want to give a spoiler away, but it ends with the same quote that it begins with, which is the quote that is reported by her husband, Karl August Varnhagen, von Ense, at her deathbed. And it's worth reading because it's obviously the quote that Arendt is most struck by in her encounter with Varnhagen, to begin and end the book with it. So I'll read it. What a history! A fugitive from Egypt and Palestine, here I am, and find help, love, fostering in you people. With real rapture, I think of these origins of mine, and this whole nexus of destiny, through which the oldest memories of the human race stand by side with the latest developments. The greatest distances in time and space are bridged. The thing which all my life seemed to me the greatest shame, which was the misery and misfortune of my life, having been born a Jewess, this I should on no account now wish to have missed. So, these are words spoken in 1833 by Rahel Varnhagen. and they really do set up many of, I think, the central thematic of Arendt's book, which is, what does it mean to be a Jew in Germany, in this case, the late 18th century or 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, and in what ways is it the greatest shame and misfortune of one's life, and in what ways is it that which she would in no account wish to have missed. That she, the fact that it's a misfortune and a shame is easier, I think, to understand, at least from her perspective. She was, as I said before, ignorant, ignorant in the sense of uneducated, not particularly pretty, something that she spoke about and thought was important. Had little money, was not very wealthy, in fact, was pretty poor. So on page 4, again in my edition, she says, not rich, not cultivated, and not beautiful. That meant that she was entirely without weapons with which to begin the great struggle for recognition in society, for social existence, for a morsel of happiness, for security and established position in the bourgeois world. So, how does a woman who is a Jew, not rich, not cultivated, and not beautiful, become recognized in the social world? And that's an important formulation, to be recognized. Again, this will come back in her book on revolution, right? Written 30 years after this original chapter was written, in which she talks about how the greatest human need is to be recognized and to be seen and to appear in public, more so than to have money, more so than to have fame or anything, to be seen. And this also will become a big theme in her book, Life of the Mind, her last book, unfinished book. So, how does somebody do this? And Arendt says, today we would want to think about it as a political struggle. We would seek to politically articulate the ways that being Jewish is made to be invisible, just like the civil rights movement did for African Americans, or the gay rights movement did for gay, lesbian, and transgender folks. The idea is you engage in a political movement to make yourself visible, to give yourself the weapons to struggle for recognition in society. And she goes through on these pages and says that this time this wasn't an option, and it wasn't the way Jews in Germany thought. And to me, this is actually one of the most interesting themes of the whole book that we're going to keep coming back to across, and it's one that I think is very relevant today for how we think about discrimination in our time, which is what she says is the weapons that were open to people like Rahel Varnhagen and Moses of Mendelssohn and other Jews of this time were not political, they were personal, they were individual. You could escape from being Jewish as an individual. You could, in a sense, be baptized, but more than that, you could prove yourself of interest to the Gentile society. And in proving yourself of interest to the Gentile society, you could gain recognition. You could become the exceptional Jew. We have the same words for exceptional blacks that we've talked about in the United States. You can escape being Jewish to some degree, and yet you remain it. And so she says, this is what was open to people like Rahel Varnhagen and David Veit and others, Moses of Mendelssohn. It wasn't a political struggle, and again, the idea that we should make this a political struggle as opposed to a personal struggle is one of the core theses of Arendt's book, Origin of Totalitarianism, written in the 1950s, right? That the big mistakes Jews have made over the ages, or one of them, is that they have not engaged politically for their rights, but they've seen it as a matter of personal or individual attainment of exceptional status. And so this is a big theme in her work throughout her life. She makes similar points about racism in the United States and civil rights in the United States. And so the idea is that you want to escape being Jewish, and yet you can never fully escape it because you're still Jewish. And that's the sort of, and that becomes part of the struggle of your life. That, and we'll get to, obviously, later in the book, her distinction between a pariah and a parvenu. But it's worth at least putting it out there for now. A pariah is an outcast, is the Jew who rebels against society and says, I am a Jew, and I don't want to conform, and I don't want to assimilate, and embraces that, or either embraces or has no choice but to embrace that outcast status. And a pariah is someone who, a Johnny-come-lately, who wants to join society. A parvenu is one to join society, and to do so has to give up who they are, because they have to, in order to join society, they have to become an exception to the Jews, and thus give up their Jewishness, and yet they never can completely. And this is the struggle that she sees that faces a group like the Jews in Europe. Within this, the first important move she makes now in this chapter, the Jewess and the Schlemihl, on page 5, again at the bottom of page 5 in my edition, paragraph beginning, Rahel's life was bound by this inferiority. Right? So she had this inferiority, this sense of failure, this not rich, not cultivated, not beautiful. And her great gift, which was also her great error for Arendt, but her great gift, was that she found a way to escape. She didn't have any of the typical weapons like wealth, cultivation, or beauty, but she had a different weapon, which is she could think. She could imagine. And so in this paragraph, Rahel's life was bound up by this inferiority. She says, given such absolute renunciation, that she must have this incredible inferiority and not be involved with the world, all that seemed left was thought. The handicaps imposed upon her by nature and society would be neutralized by the mania for examining everything and asking questions with inhuman persistence. Objective and impersonal thought was able to minimize the purely human, purely accidental quality of unhappiness. And so what Rahel could do is she could think, and she could examine everything and ask questions with inhuman persistence, and in doing so she could reason, and in this reasoning she could begin to liberate herself from the world that was so inhospitable to her. She could create, in a sense, her own world, a world liberated from the prejudices of the past, a world that was, in a sense, all based on fantasy. She could create a fantasy world, a world in which she was interesting. And this self-thinking, right? So self-thinking is one of those ideas that Arendt lauds and praises throughout her life. She praises those people who think for themselves, who aren't conformists, and that's absolutely right. She does value that quite heavily, and I think she is one. But here she's articulating and exploring a danger in self-thinking, which is that the self-thinker is a thinker of fantasy, is someone who's escaping the world and thus creating a lie. And this is quite related to the chapters on in the origins of totalitarianism on movements, in which she says that the essence of the totalitarian mind and the totalitarian virus, she says, is that we create fantasy worlds that are divorced from reality and then try and realize them. Rahel Varnhagen is not a totalitarian because she has no power. You can't terrorize people into making her fantasy real. But the origins of totalitarianism, I'm sorry, that's just the way it came out, but when Arendt writes the origins of totalitarianism, and she asks, in the end, what is it that made totalitarianism possible? What was the new experience that made totalitarianism possible? Her answer is what she calls in the book loneliness, and what she calls in early essays in the 1950s being abandoned. And it's in being abandoned, in the mass feeling of being abandoned and the mass feeling of loneliness, in which people have a sense that they are Schlemihl's, that they have no power in the world, that they can't achieve anything in the world. The world is alien to them. What they most need and want is to remake the world in a way that gives them power and makes sense. And those are the people who become susceptible to totalitarian movements, and totalitarian ideologies, and totalitarian powers. Now again, she's writing this long before this, and I'm not suggesting at all. What I am suggesting though is that her understanding of totalitarianism is informed by this writing in this chapter on introspection and romanticism. The idea that she says that if thinking rebounds back upon itself and finds its solitary object within the soul, if that is, it becomes introspection. And this is going to be one of the main thematic words of the book, so we're going to have to sort of address this. If thinking becomes introspection, a looking in, what's the opposite of that? A looking out at the world. If thinking is an escape from the world and an attempt to avoid the world and becomes introspection, it distinctly produces, so long as it remains rational, a semblance of unlimited power. Listen to these words, unlimited power, a semblance of unlimited power by the very act of isolation from the world. Introspection gives you the fantasy, the semblance of unlimited power. Because in introspection, all the things about the world which prevent you from being recognized, that take away your power, that make it impossible for you to do what you want, to be who you want to be, can be, of course, imagined away. And in such a world of introspection, you become free. You become autonomous. So she says, by ceasing to be interested in the world, it also sets up a bastion in front of the one interesting object, the inner self. In the isolation achieved by introspection, thinking becomes limitless because it is no longer molested by anything exterior. I mean, these are words that are almost verbatim in the origins of totalitarianism in the chapters on ideology and terror and on the chapter on movements. And it's shocking how, I mean, this is what Sam said earlier about how much of this comes back later, but it's shocking how this writing about introspection becomes so important in her thinking about totalitarianism in the 1950s. Man's autonomy becomes hegemony over all possibilities. Reality merely impinges and rebounds. And of course, the great thinker of introspection, who she then goes on to discuss, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who at one point, Rahel, because she was brilliant in her own way, in a letter she signs to David Veit, signs it Confessions de Gégé Rahel. So she saw what she was doing and the connection of what she was doing with Rousseau, which was creating a mania for introspection. And Arendt's view on this, and Rahel saw this. She says that what she's doing is lying. She quotes her, "Lying is lovely if we choose it, and is an important component of our freedom." By the way, in her essay Truth and Politics, Arendt is going to say similar things. But the point is that introspection engenders mendacity. When you live within introspection, facts mean nothing to me. This is a quote from Rahel. "Facts mean nothing at all to me," she writes to David Veit, because she lives in this world. And every fact can be wiped out by a lie. This is, of course, stuff we're all talking a lot about today. When can facts be wiped out by a lie? That's the question we should really be talking about. And Arendt's answer is, when we, as powerless Schlemihl's, turn away from the world into ourselves. That's when lying makes a reality, and facts can be wiped out by the lie. So on in this section here, this is really what Arendt is. This is the beginning of Arendt's interest in Rahel, that she's able to consciously, self-consciously understand that without, as she calls it, the weapons of beauty, cultivation, and wealth, she is able to fight for social recognition, not politically, but as an individual, through the power of introspection and the capacity to lie so powerfully that she can create a space for her to enter the world. On page 14 to 15, again in my edition, Arendt writes, "The true joy of conversation consisted in being understood. The more imaginary a life is, the more imaginary its sufferings, the greater is the craving for an audience, for confirmation." So the more we are powerless and then compose our life as an imagination, the more we need to be affirmed and confirmed in who we are, which is why Rahel so desperately reached out to people and wanted them to accept her and her version, her confession of herself in the Rousseauian sense. So there's more to say about this than the last, but I want to stop for a second and give us a chance to talk about it, answer some of your questions, or let you guys engage in this. So Rowena writes, "This sounds very similar to identity politics, but I understand from Arendt's later work that she was against identity politics. How can this be reconciled?" Well, I mean, there's a couple things. I'm not sure it's identity politics, but it is. Arendt does think that Rahel, like many of the romantics of the time, Schlegel and Rousseau, exited the world into a world of introspection. Arendt is critical of this. I mean, I want to be clear. I said she sees this as her great error, and yet she also is fascinated by it and understands that for someone like Rahel, who had very little other options, it made sense for her. You want to say something more about that right now? I'm not sure if what makes you see this as part of identity politics? Rowena, are you there or not? Well, I think so. Daphne writes, I think her point, or maybe it is mine, is that one is always destined to be regarded as Jewish, even if one did not want to be. That's exactly right. And for someone like Rahel, there was a lifelong interest in overcoming that or escaping being Jewish. And what Arendt is saying is that was the way open for Jews. And yet, by the end of her life, in some complicated way, Arendt says that even though I spent my whole life trying to escape being Jewish, I would never have traded it for anything. What does that mean? Is that an embrace of her destiny as Jewish? And we'll obviously have to confront that as we go through the book. But I think that's one of her main points. If either Rowena or Daphne wants to add in or join in, they can. Maria writes, does the break from belonging have something to do with the redirection of focus from the world and into the self? Yes, it does, Maria. I mean, this is what I was going to get to in the next couple pages. But this discussion, again, in my edition on page 15, the paragraph begins, indiscretion and shamelessness were phenomena of the age. Here, Arendt is going to talk about Rousseau, but add in this line about 5 lines down. With the loss of the priest and his judgment, the solitude of the would-be confessor had become boundless. The singularity of a person, the uniqueness of the individual character, stood out against a background of indefinite anonymity. Everything was equally important and nothing forbidden. If I understand Maria's question right, and you can tell me, Maria, if I do understand it right, this loss of the priest and his judgment, where everything was equally important and nothing forbidden, the solitude of the would-be confessor had become boundless. This is what I take to be the loss of belonging, the loss of being part of a world, a historical world, a world that gives your life sense and purpose in it. And in such a world, having lost that gravitas, that Schwergewicht, that weight that gives yourself meaning in Nietzsche's terms, what Rousseau most wanted was to confess what he felt, what he desired and wished, not what he did. He didn't confess things he did. He confessed his thoughts. Why is that? Why do you confess your thoughts? Because they're general, they're not specific. And as a result, it's hard to be blamed for them. And the shame is taken away because they're general thoughts. I generally, Rousseau said it, wanted to have sex with everybody. I generally, wanted to have kids but not take care of them. It was never specific. And so he was able to say what he felt and have it be accepted as honesty and therefore as meaningful, but without the without actually the specificity that would carry with it potential judgment. And this is the real, this is the beginning of, I think, one of the real critiques in this book, or questions, which is that this move towards introspection moves us towards a kind of, and this goes back to the question earlier about Elizabeth Anderson, moves us away from a grounded, concrete life into a life of general fantasies. And that's part of what we're addressing here. So Maria or Daphne or Rowena, do any of you want to respond to any of that or add to it?
I think that the question came up, or my response at least came up, when you were talking about how Jews, and this is the sentence in the book where she says Jews did not even want to be emancipated as a whole. All they wanted to do was escape from Jewishness as individuals. And so I think that was when the issue of identity politics came into light, and I think that the point was throughout that even if they wanted to act politically, that would merely more firmly cement them in that Jewishness, because they were then part of a group. So the only recourse they would have had to escape from perpetually being considered Jewish was to do so individually, and even that didn't work very well.
I understand the question now. Thank you. So I think Arendt is nothing if not insistence that we act politically. The way, whatever she would think of identity politics, and it's a complicated term. She has nothing against groups of people pursuing their interests in politics. So if you're, a group of farm workers and you want a farm bill, she has nothing against you advocating for your interests. And if you're Jews and you want laws that allow you to, observe the Sabbath, she has nothing against you advocating for your interests. And if you're refugees and you want asylum, she would have nothing against you advocating for your interests. So if you're going to say she's not against groups of people advocating for your interests, to the extent she's, we can get into a long conversation about what identity politics is and what she's opposed to it. I think to the extent that identity politics is a rejection of a common citizenship and a claim for only. Whoops! Excuse me, 1 second. Then it would be it would not embrace the fullness of the polity. But she's certainly not against people advocating for their interests as a group. I don't think she thinks of it as based on identities. Usually, she thinks of it as based on interests, and that would be a big difference. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that, or Sam wants to add to that. But again, she interest-based politics is perfectly legitimate for her. Anyone else? Sam, you want to add something?
I was just going to say, when I read the question initially, the example that sprung to mind, and I'm not sure if it's helpful or in drawing the distinction, is Um, you know, identity politics today is often about claimed identities and not about identities as one was born with, but rather how one ought to have been born. And I think that that does cut to part of the distinction Arendt is making between those who choose to either embrace who it is they are or to turn against it and take on a new identity in some way. And I think that's where the hairy part of the question lies, because today the argument is, well, I was born into the wrong body, and this is who I actually am. Or I was born into the wrong class, or I'm white, but I'm actually, as a congressman said yesterday, Chinese or Asian, I think. So people are making claims on their identity that differ from how it is they were born. And when I read Arendt, I hear her making the argument that as long as we try to cast off who it is we were born as, that we'll experience some kind of existential suffering in the world. I think that further entrenches us in the conversation, though, than helps us out of it.
Anyone else want to add?
Yeah, I just want to add that I think in Origins, she criticizes the Jews for not joining in with the other groups that were dealing with, labor issues and so forth. So I think even where there is an identity group, she seemed to be saying we need to try and build those kinds of alliances across different groups.
I think I'd like to add here, if I can, that she's talking about individual Jews tossing off their Jewishness, so to speak, which becomes assimilation. In fact, in the time of Rahel Varnhagen, it meant actually getting yourself baptized. You became a member of the other community, and in a period during which what is referred to as the emancipation, during which the Jewish people as a group, especially in Germany, were receiving rights that had previously been denied. So as time progresses, the acquisition of rights actually brings more Jews into positions of relative power. And it is then that political anti-Semitism comes into existence, as she mentions in Origins. And once there is a political anti-Semitism, then there is an identity political response, and that is Zionism. Zionism is identity politics in response to political anti-Semitism that arose in the 19th century. That's the way I see it, anyway.
And yet, in her later writings, and certainly in her Jewish writings, she certainly opposes Zionism. She also argued that during the time that she wrote this, and obviously later on during the time she wrote the Origins, one of her points was that Jews never actually understood their history. So forgetting being Jewish or trying to not be Jewish implies that they had a history to not conform to or to not accept. So there are contradictions, I think, in her stance on Judaism and belonging, which I find throughout her writings also maybe illustrate some of her own development of thinking, because God forbid she should be static in one position when she's, in her early 20s and also in her 60s.
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated. I mean, her ideas of Zionism, I mean, she was certainly loosely affiliated with certain Zionist circles at some points. I mean, I think Jack's formulation is actually quite helpful. Zionism was one form of identity politics. And while she did think that if you were attacked as a Jew, you need to defend yourself as a Jew, she, I think, was never fully comfortable with saying that because I was born a Jew, I am above all a Jew, and Jew is, and my politics should be first and foremost influenced by the fact that I'm Jewish, my identity as a Jew. I have many identities, Jew, class-based, professor, man, white, all sorts of different identities. And the idea that one identity is going to sort of stand in for the entirety of it and become the sort of cornerstone of my politics, I think for her was always reductive. And that may be where Daphne's claim that she was, opposed to identity politics would be found, and I think that's right. Her opposition to Zionism, at least later, becomes because of a kind of Zionism that emerges, Jabotinsky kind of Zionism, which she thinks is too nationalistic. But I think she is skeptical of the claim that any one particular identity that I'm born with or that I embrace or whatever becomes the be all and end all of who I am. So Jennifer, yeah, go ahead.
Just add really quickly on that and what Jack said. In her correspondence with Jaspers, she says that being Jewish was a fact of her birth. And she always treated it as a fact of her existence and not as part of an identity in the sense that we would want to talk about identity today, but that I was born as this is what I am. And I think that's part of the distinction that she's drawing and part of what I think Jack was drawing out of totalitarianism, when the identity becomes politicized in a certain way, and then it takes on this kind of ideological nature, which is how it is, I think, primarily used in conversation today, differently than how Arendt was using it when she was writing. I think she's thinking of it much more as a fact in a kind of certain given sense than something that one constructs for themselves.
Right. Let's turn to Jennifer, please. Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. May I ask a question? I'm wondering whether Hannah Arendt's critique of Rahel's turning us away from reality and turning to a world is not at the same time a critique of all the non-Jewish German Romantic authors of this period, as Schlegel, as a lot of them, who noticed that politically there weren't any possibility to make a revolution in Germany. And literature invented exactly that, a kind of introspection, of way to go to a world of fantasy instead of turning to reality. You know what I mean?
Very much, Karin. She talks about Schlegel explicitly in this chapter.
Exactly.
In his book Lucinda. And yes, I think she's being critical here of Rousseau, of Schlegel, of the Romantic tradition as it's emerging. And she sees in many ways Rahel as a brilliantly insightful example of how Romanticism works and potentially can go astray. But I think that's exactly, and this book is a critique of German Romanticism. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
So yes, exactly. So Jennifer asks for examples. I think it's always good to try. The examples. What are the examples? Jennifer says the idea of lying wiped out facts, right? Which is what Arendt says, quoting Rahel. And Jennifer says, what are some examples of this? Jennifer, did you want to give some, or do you want us to give some? Was this a question, or were you wanting to put some examples out there?
what you talked about. In fact, I was so intrigued, I wrote it down, and I'm trying to, because right now I'm thinking about all the lies in front of me.
Yeah.
And that right now we're in a time where I'm watching people lie, and other people are taking up the lie and saying, see, you're wrong, not us. And I try to point out the lie. But what you said isn't quite that. It's something else. That lying can wipe out a fact. So how does lying wipe out a fact? Because you start to believe the lie.
On its most basic level, think of it, Rahel is lying and saying, look, I've been a Jew my whole life. It's been terrible. So who am I? I'm no longer Rahel Levin. I'm Rahel Varnhagen. I'm the wife of an important German non-Jew. And I live that life, and I assimilate. I live the life of a parvenu, and I embrace that. And while the fact is never completely wiped out, I'm still a Jew, I'm still a Schlemihl, I increasingly create this fantasy world in which I am Rahel Varnhagen, and I can live differently. I think on the most basic level, that's what she's talking about. On a more political level, if the Nazis continue to say that the Jews will be exterminated, at some point, people start to believe it, and they see it as simply the new fact. Or if the Bolsheviks say that the bourgeoisie are class enemies, at some point it becomes the concrete nature of each bourgeoisie and each person disappears, and the new lie becomes a fact, and the old facts disappear. The power of lying. Now, in the Nazi and Bolshevik example, which are examples she talks about in the Origins of Totalitarianism, the lies are backed by power. In Rahel's lies are not backed by any power. They're backed simply by an increasing romantic culture, as Karine Biro was just saying, of introspection, in which more and more living in this isolated introspection, we accept as real a world of feelings and a world of ideas that has no connection to reality. And in fact, reality we find oppressive, and so we increasingly live in our heads. This is the romantic idea. Romanticism emerges at this time not because the Romantics were Jews and Schlemihls, but because the overarching sense of belonging and meaning of the public world began to feel oppressive. And people felt, on the one hand, they were told, you're individuals, you should have power, right? This is the Enlightenment. On the other hand, they felt powerless. And the Rousseauian answer to that was, I am Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I can be whoever I want. I can live in my head. And that's more powerful and more important than who Jean-Jacques Rousseau is, out in the world. You want to add something,
Well,
Jennifer?
isn't that also the romanticism of these current, I'll call them authoritarians, who want to keep our country the way they think it should be in their heads? This idea of America, which is really Levittown in their heads. with no people that don't look like them. They're clinging to that romantic idea, which is essentially a lie, because that it existed in Levittown, but it didn't exist in Jackson, Mississippi. That's a lie.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think is important to do is to see the connections between introspection and political lying, and also to keep the differences. And that's what, because political lies have to be backed up by power in some way or ideology, whereas the kind of lies Rahel is telling and Jean-Jacques Rousseau are telling are not necessarily political. They're more they're individual, and there are ways that individuals who are powerless, who feel themselves powerless, who are powerless, however you want to put it, can find, as Arendt calls it, weapons to fight for recognition in a world in which they're not given recognition. That's the romantic move that Rousseau and Schlegel are talking about, and that Rahel embodies as a Schlemihl who fights for her own recognition.
Again, another point that Arendt makes is a distinction about when confessions are made to posterity, and I really thought it was interesting that she creates a portrait of people creating their own worlds in their own heads, but some of them are very important because they are remembered and they become models for people later in a totally different time and place, so that you cannot make a revolution, but you can imagine a revolution. And if you imagine a revolution clearly enough, then 2 generations later, somebody might actually pick your revolution up out of your mind and try to put it into reality.
Yeah, let's read that passage on posterity, because it's an important one. Again, in my book, it's on bottom of page 15. It's the paragraph that begins, uninhibited utterance becomes open indiscretion if it is not addressed to posterity, but to a real listener who is merely treated as if he were anonymous, as if he could reply, as if he could not reply, as if he existed simply and solely to listen. We find only too ample evidence of such indiscretion among Rahel's closest associates. Its classic representation may be found in Friedrich Schlegel's Lucinde. Uninhibited utterance. We have I think we can use an example. We have a president who seems to engage in uninhibited utterance at times, which many people find, in the words Arendt would call here, open indiscretion. But it becomes open indiscretion if it is not addressed to posterity, but to a real listener. And so one of the things that confessional lying, one of the ways it works and avoids being seen as an open indiscretion, is that it's not addressed to a person. It's not addressed to to anyone particular, to a real listener. It's addressed to someone anonymous. And because it's addressed to someone anonymous, it loses its offense. It loses its indiscretion. And it becomes testimony of an authentic mood, an authentic feeling. And it gives this sense of my feeling, a sense of objective public importance. And so that's part of what is going on here, is that we're, even in our political worldly discourse today, if this is making sense, someone will tell me. But in our political worldly discourse today, we're increasingly speaking in this abstract, general, introspective, subjective way that is often not about the world, but is sort of addressed to an anonymous posterity that seeks to give my mood recognition. Like Rahel wanted a recognition, wanted to be seen as meaningful. I think that a lot of what the president is doing, at least in this country, is giving voice to objective voice to subjective moods and feelings that people feel powerless to express. And that's somewhat similar to what she saw Rahel doing on an individual basis, if I'm able to make that leap. If anyone wants to tell me I'm wrong, I'm happy to hear it, because we'll see. So I'm just looking for questions. Rohana writes, Jenny Lynn understood what I was referring to. Would there have been a way for Jews to engage politically that wasn't identity politics? Yes, I mean, I think Jews could have fought for the rights to be citizens. They certainly could have fought for the rights for education for all citizens. They could. There's all sorts of political struggles which are simply about interests, and you can have an interest as a Jew or as a poor Jew or as a rich Jew, but are not. Again, identity politics I find a somewhat mushy term, so I don't like using it so much. But the problem with identity politics is not that you're fighting for your interests as Jews when your interests are being abused. The problem with identity politics is when you can only fight for your Jewish interests, and that's all you fight for, and you don't fight for any other interests. And if there's a Jew and they want to fight for other interests, you exclude them, and you say you're not a Jew or something like that. Then, politics is not about fighting for interests, it's about affirming your identity. And that's not what she would imagine a healthy politics would be. Does that answer your question, Roena? I'll move on to Johanna. Johanna writes, cannot introspection also serve to uncover the lies we may or some other entity, may create? Perhaps it can make one come face to face with an untruth. For example, that it was right to destroy the Jews because they were responsible for the misery Germans suffered after World War I. I think introspection might compel one to examine the lie one is living. It is something missing right now in America. Okay, that's an important point. Introspection frees you from the world. And so, on one level, introspection is a healthy aspect of self-thinking in which you free yourself from the conformist views of the world, and you're able to take up your own view, free from the prejudices of the time and the conformities of the time. So, in one sense, in one important way, introspection is a way that you find a space, a room of your own, to use a phrase, to think outside of a patriarchy or a whatever it is, or a Gentile society. And so, but the problem that Arendt is here, or the phenomena that Arendt is here exploring, is when introspection is not simply a way to find space to then think about the world, but becomes an alternative reality or alternative world itself. And that's the danger she sees in the kind of romanticized introspection that we're beginning to confront here. Is that, you want to add to that, Johanna, or?
I'm thinking about examining truth and untruth, and sometimes one needs to extricate oneself from the particular situation to look at that, that is being held up as truth when we know that it isn't, or maybe we don't know that it isn't. But for me, that's an important first step in sort of examining my own thoughts about what I'm doing in a political situation, and also to look at that political situation in a more objective way, not subjective way. I don't find it dangerous. I think it's very important, but apparently, obviously, this is what Hannah Arendt is actually arguing, and she finds. I think being able to extricate herself in some way from the constraints that she experienced as a Jew and also as a woman, which is not being talked about very much also, but that she said she in some way frees herself from those confines and is able to step back and look at the world and at politics in the ways that she did.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be very clear. I don't think she's 100% on board with you in saying we need to be able to step outside of the world in order to look at it with free eyes. I mean, that's very much how she understands her own way of approaching the world. She calls herself a conscious pariah, someone who consciously stands outside of the world in order to look at it impartially. And that's very much the way she wants to encourage other people as well, I think, to look at the world. So the problem is with the word introspection, to some degree, which she is discussing here as part of a tradition of romantic thought, in which introspection is not simply finding a space outside of prejudices and outside of the world in order to look at it, but to find a space outside of the world and then live in that space and, in a sense, ignore the world. That's the danger she's talking about. And there's a fine line between them. Is there anything else anyone else wants to ask or discuss? We have about 10 minutes. Anyone want to? Is there a particular line or comment that people wanted to bring up?
To add to the conversation we're having, it's on page 20 in my volume, which is this one. I think it's 14 in Roger's volume. She says, the more imaginary a life is, the more imaginary its sufferings, the greater is the craving for an audience for confirmation. And I think that's a really poignant line that ties together both the conversation we were having about identity politics today and about truth and falsehood right now. I mean, she doesn't have her concept of thinking here yet, which allows us to engage with the world objectively, and introspection is doing a different kind of work here as a kind of imaginary turning in upon oneself, where you get to create a new reality for yourself and then liberate it into the world. And Rousseau is actually a really powerful, I think, a good example of this. In his Confessions, there are debates today among his intellectual historians and political theorists about whether Rousseau had 7 children and raised them with his illiterate wife, whether he gave them all away to the state, or whether he never had any children at all. We don't actually have the facts straight in any sense because of his storytelling, because of the way he was able to liberate his own biohistorical narrative from posterity to judge him. And I think this is one of the things that, this is where Roger started the conversation today, with social media and all of these personas we get to invent for ourselves. How do we actually get to encounter one another, to meet one another, to come face to face with one another as human beings, as who we are, when we're constantly encountering these projected images that we've crafted of ourselves to exist independently of us before one another? And I think this text really, I don't think Arendt really gets to this question anywhere else that I can think of. So, I mean, if you took that passage I just read and you posted that in the context of identity politics debates today, I mean, I think you would get a lot of public flack, about the creation of an imaginary self and the desire for recognition.
I think that's really very interesting, Sam, and I think that but I'd like to point out that before there were social media, people created multiple images of themselves in public and in private. That's the nature of being, so to speak. And but social media gives it a different kind of life, which is really kind of interesting because all of your fantasies can now actually live into posterity, and that's a pretty amazing thought.
Yeah, I mean, social media doesn't create introspection, right? Rousseau was doing this, and it's been doing it for thousands of years. The certain technologies emerge when there's an increasing need for them. The novel emerged in the 17th century or so, because in 18th century, because there was this need for people to talk about their inner life. And Arendt talks a lot about the novel as and she's not the only one, as sort of this technology for people talking about introspection. Facebook and social media is another. So it's not the claim that it's never happened before. It's the claim. I mean, what I think is interesting about it as an idea is that it has through the new technologies that have clearly been embraced, it allows an introspective flight from reality to be ever more real in your daily life. That's what strikes me about social media today. I mean, you can live for a large percentage of your life engaging in a world with people who you don't know as your main source of human interaction. People who are generalized bots, for all you know. And even if they're not bots, act like bots because they speak a generalized, non-specific, politicized language that doesn't go to the details. And that's sort of the danger of something like Facebook, that people who live in it will increasingly completely forget how to live with other human beings who disagree with them, who grate on them, who are difficult. Anyway, we could end on that depressing note, unless someone else has something to say. So interestingly enough, the next chapter is called Into the World, right? And this is going to be a chapter in which we see Rahel entering the world and seeking to be a part of that world. And so it'll be an interesting opposition to what we've been talking about today to some degree. So I look forward to that. Sam and I are going to alternate week events, so it'll be fun. You'll get to hear both of us present this book. This is a great book for us to read because it's really quite a different book of Hannah Arendt's, and yet so many of the ideas are there. So I hope I'm very much looking forward to continue reading it with you all, and we will have a great year. Thank you all very much, and continue reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Roger.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.